If you listen to enough of this podcast, you might be concerned that we're approaching a major collapse of governments, financial markets, or even the Western developed world in its entirety. So when the revolution comes, do you want to be out of shape and unable to defend yourself, or do you want to be fighting fit? Why not try Fight Camp? Fight Camp is interactive at-home boxing. They bring the best workout in the world into your home and make it fun. Explore thousands of workouts led by expert trainers with decades of experience teaching proper boxing form and technique. Fight Camp has live punch counting stats that motivate you by counting every punch throughout your workout and pushing you to meet goals every single round. As you progress, you'll unlock achievements and can go head to head against other members, whether they're across the country or across your living room. One of the best things about Fight Camp is that it makes boxing accessible to everyone, no matter what fitness level you're at, what your age is, or what your experience with boxing is. You can do it. And you're going to have a great time as well. So join the biggest boxing community in the world without ever leaving your home. Fight Camp packages start at just $99. They even offer some great financing options, so you can get started for just $9 a month. To get everything you need, go to fightcamp.com/chatter to learn more. That's fightcamp.com/chatter. CHATTER. Wonderful. Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I'm joined by Stephanie Savell, the co-director of the Cost of War project at Brown University. Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Let me just put my phone on silent here.
Yeah, always good. I might actually have to check that I have done that at some point, although I don't know where my phone is. But yeah, as I mentioned before we started recording there, the reason that I thought it was a good time to have you on was because, yeah, we're in a bit of a scary time. Nuclear war is being openly discussed. There's a lot of talk about we're on the brink of World War III, and obviously Ukraine is not in a good way. There's escalating levels of fighting and bombing going on there, and I thought it would be useful to get a perspective on what war does, and try not to get caught up in the minute details of what's going on right now, and just think about like the greater cost of things.
The bigger picture. Yeah, my colleague Nita Crawford, she was one of the founders of the Cost of War project, which I co-direct now, but she founded it back in 2011. And she always says, people when politicians are getting into wars, they say they make arguments about them being cheap and quick and efficient at meeting their goals. And that's never the case. It's impossible for a war to be cheap, quick, or efficient. Just not going to happen.
Yeah. And then I was listening to one of the recent Cost of War podcasts in which they kind of explored like all of these like second effects or secondary effects where, it's the impact on veterans' mental health, upon like the massive bloated military budget leads to like a militarization of the police forces, which escalates police violence, and it just these are all these things that you don't think about in the time when everyone's sort of gunning for it.
That's right, and that's what the Cost of War project is all about: is just taking a step back to look at the bigger view and the bigger picture, and say what are the costs that are unacknowledged, that are deeper, and really the point of our putting the research out there is to just promote a more consistent critical questioning of war and militarism, and just promote a more informed ability on a broader scale to just ask the big picture questions, like should we be going to war at all, and what really protects people both in the US and around the world. What actually does safety mean? What's the best way of accomplishing that? So that's what we really hope our research can do.
So I'd like to start by diving into some of the sort of like more headline findings that are listed on the website. So, and sort of how you go about calculating it. So just so people have an idea, actually let me pull it up on screen here for people who are watching. That would be really good. So we have 929,000 people have died in post 9/11 wars due to direct war violence, and several times as many due to the reverberating effects. 387,000 civilians have been killed as a result of the fighting. 38 million people have been displaced, and the federal price tag for the US government is over $8 trillion.
Right. So these are the post 9/11 wars we're talking about. So
Yeah.
everything that began with President George W. Bush's invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 in the name of the global war on terror, and all of the actions that what was called the global war on terror at the time has led to.
So I guess my first question is like, how do you even go about calculating these kinds of figures like that? It's like, I'm not saying I don't believe you. Just I'm curious about how like do you have to go to individual countries to get the data from them? Is it like on the ground reporting? Like how do you go about figuring this all out?
Yeah, it really varies depending on which figure you're talking about. And this colleague, Dr. Crawford, who I mentioned, who actually has a new position now at the University of Oxford, so she's in the UK.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, she's really, I mean, she's been kind of pioneering in coming up with these big estimates. And what she talks about is coming up with a reasonable and conservative estimate. So she never makes a claim that hers is a definitive number. In fact, when it comes to calculating a death toll from a conflict, it's kind of notoriously impossible to come up with a very accurate count. There's so many political decisions about who gets counted and why, especially when it comes to who got killed by who, and even the kind of birth and death records in a lot of the countries that we're focusing on, like Afghanistan, are really poor or non-existent. So you're really talking about. And then you kind of get into the kind of what I mean by political decision making is, the people on the ground might say that a certain number of people in their village were killed by a US airstrike, for example. And then the US will say, oh, well, no, that, those are only, fighters. Those were Al Qaeda. So therefore they don't count really as deaths, and because civilians are the ones that governments are really held accountable for. I'm, of course, very critical of that logic, if you can't tell by my tone, but and then so then it gets very contested, and the US will go in and kind of do a kind of use aerial surveillance technology to say, oh, well, there's this number of graves from this recent strike, and so that therefore, and then the people on the ground are saying, but you're reconfirming your own biases of your drone operators to begin with, that you are only counting these people, right? So there are these kinds of debates that go into even something that sounds on the surface simple, like a death toll. And so basically what you have to do is kind of triangulate a whole bunch of different sources. And so we use a lot of sources from the UN, which themselves are open up to critique, right? So there's that. There's government statistics. There's a lot of we draw on a lot of independent investigative journalism projects, like the Iraq Body Count, and independent journalists as well. Nonprofit groups. There's a group called Moantana for Human Rights in Yemen that does a really great job with documenting deaths from US airstrikes, among other things. So you kind of just like put the pieces together. That is what I'll say about the human. Oh, and one more thing to say at this point about the human toll is that what sounds like an aside, that kind of, several times as many more due to the reverberating effects of war. You said 929,000 people killed directly, and that's through the direct weapons of war, through combat and bombs and bullets. And the ripple effects of war are in fact far more deadly. And I just can't emphasize that enough. I'm actually writing a paper about this right now. And it's just so devastating once you start getting into the details, I'm a mom. I have an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old. And what I realized in reading some of this stuff that's written about the reverberating effects in Afghanistan and Iraq and Yemen and Syria and Somalia, some of these other hotspots of the US post 9/11 wars and counterterrorism, is that it's children. I mean, it's really what we're talking about is children. Like 50% of children in Afghanistan right now are wasting or projected to be wasting, which means literally, wasting away to the skin and bone. Like, and children die of both that extreme malnutrition and then also of the fact that, when you're malnourished, it's far easier to contract a disease like acute diarrhea or cholera and then die of that because your body's much more susceptible to illness. I just can't emphasize enough that that's what this suffering, that's what we're talking about, is a lot of death from things like malnutrition and disease as a consequence of hospital systems or health systems being decimated by war, and food systems being disrupted, medicine supply chains being disrupted, healthcare workers having to flee, hospitals being attacked. I mean, all of these things are happening in war, and these are all leading to a huge amount of death and suffering, disease and injury. So just to switch gears for a second to the numbers of the budgetary costs of war.
Tell you what, actually, can we come back to the budget, because I do want to talk about that, and then sort of more broadly about like the cost of the military generally, and whether like we need it or that sort of thing. But like there's like two things I want to ask about here. Is first the sort of like what you think is, since you said you're writing a paper on it, actually we'll start with this, these second order effects that sort of ripple out and cause like quite probably like multi-generational damage. Like, what do you think is the most impactful part of that, or the most damaging? Like, do you think it's like the psychological effects on like both individuals and like the wider society, or do you think it's like the physical damage to the country and like the infrastructure and the land, and that, like, what do you think is more damaging?
I mean, you're absolutely right in talking about it as multi-generational, because a malnourished kid, for example, at key moments in their development, they develop developmental disorders, and so then their growth is stunted. They just don't even have the same kind of brain power, even if they do grow into adults, as if they had proper food when they were a child. So there's that. It's yes, both. I mean, the mental trauma is undeniable, and it's so understudied. We just don't know enough. One story I like to share is a story by one of our contributors who's an Afghan scholar of Afghanistan. Her name is Anila Dilatsai, and she talks about war. She writes about war widows in Afghanistan, and she writes about the use of heroin and the fact that there were during the US-led war like programs to help widows who had lost their husbands in the violence, and they're a lot of times male children, brothers, fathers, but you have to kind of show that you're deserving of this aid by being a good worker and not being, not having any addiction to heroin. It's kind of it's a way that people have turned to cope with the kind of extent of this grief and trauma. And she writes about how there's the woman she tells the story of who kind of defiantly chooses to use heroin and not get the aid from the aid program. And she's saying, this is the way that this woman is choosing to live. It's her way of choosing life and not death. It's the only way that she can live, given the circumstances, given that she lost her husband and her sons. And just if you think about the ramifications of the choice for life being an addiction to heroin and what that means and what kind of a life that woman lives, you start to begin to grasp, I think, the magnitude of the suffering, right?
Is it because she didn't want to take help from people who were like enabling the violence that had led her to that situation?
It was more like she just was, it was kind of a big, like, forget you, like don't tell me how I should cope or how I should deal with my grief,
Mm.
like this is all the only way I can manage.
Mm.
And um so yeah, and this same scholar, Dr. Delatsai, talks about people saying to her, I can't taste my food anymore in Afghanistan. I don't want to live another day. Like these kinds of statements are really common. And you think about the effects on that we've had papers also on even just on US service members
Yeah.
and vets who have gone through these wars, and how 4 times as many have died by suicide than actually in combat, right? Over 30,000 US service members and vets of the post 9/11 wars have died by suicide. So the mental trauma is just you can't it's hard to fully grasp, but it's also you can't underestimate it, right?
Mm.
And then there's the infrastructure and the fact that war plunges entire countries into poverty. It's the whole economy gets decimated. People can no longer secure basic livelihood, and that is the biggest, I mean, killer, right? Because if you can't afford to buy food, you can't eat, and that has huge consequences for your life and your, death. And same, like you can't afford to take your kid to the doctor if they get sick. That just these very, very basic things that in a lot of us of more privilege in Western countries kind of just take for granted.
Yeah, I was just thinking about like how obviously they're having to suffer the physical damage and the suffer living through a war zone, but like the human psychological effects are mirrored in both countries. Like there's no winner here from it. And as well, you mentioned in heroin, it's just like it chimes so like tragically with the opioid crisis as well, that sort of like embroils so many veterans in the US. Like
Yeah.
it's really tragic, and like to that end, like, and to the 387,000 civilians killed as a direct result of the fighting, who okayed this? Like no, but like seriously, right? Okay, so we have the UN and we have like this, global peace, where there's lots of like little skirmish wars going on, right? And like, who gets to sort of like decide that our war is just enough to and righteous enough to justify the deaths of like innocent people, like in the court of like international affairs? Like, who is it that's meant to sort of say, actually, hang on, like you're killing too many civilians there? Like, is it the UN, or
Right.
is there someone?
Yeah, I mean, there are international conventions and norms governing war, and the Geneva Conventions is one. There are theories of just war. I personally am not a scholar of the kind of the laws and governing structures around this. I mean, some people say that really, if you're talking about whether a particular action in war is just or unjust, it's kind of missing the point. I mean, it obviously it needs to happen. There need to be people who are experts in that. There needs to be expertise around that. But fundamentally, like, isn't it? Can't we just talk about it being like wrong to kill, and wrong? Just like any war at all is not a good way of solving problems.
Hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like a great way to sort of throw human life at a problem. Um, but unfortunately, that's what we've been doing for many thousands of years.
Yeah, although as I'm an anthropologist, so I have to interject there and say that, one of the things I think a lot of us just assume is that, war is just inevitable and it's a part of human nature. And that actually there's lots of cross-cultural and historical research, lots of societies that use other means of conflict resolution.
Okay, could you give us a cool example?
Oh, no, I can't give you an example off the top of my head, unfortunately. I should learn one of
That's all
those.
right. Well, I mean, there was plenty of cultures who were not as violent and who were more violent. I mean, the Greeks like to talk their problems out until they didn't. Or there's definitely examples of neutral and non-violent countries becoming very prosperous and successful. The Swiss, for example. Anyway, the then to go sort of back to our question about the price tag.
Mm.
So yeah, the estimated cost of wars post 9/11 is $8 trillion. It's such an unfathomably huge, like stupid sum of money. So like, where on earth did that all go? Is that just like guns and bullets, or like where did that go?
Right. So this is a calculation that, again, it has this kind of cost of war project ethos of kind of taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture. So there's the money that the US has spent in what it calls overseas contingency operations, which is it's kind of like the war slush fund in the United States. Over and above the regular Pentagon budget that has gone to fund the post 9/11 wars. And this overseas contingency operations funding has been about 2 billion, including for Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. So 2 billion of the 8 is the actual money that has been in this war fund. But then there's like, you can't talk about war spending, we argue, without talking about care for veterans of the wars, right? So this money is obligated by the United States government to veterans of the military throughout the course of their lifetimes. And so if you're going to talk about the cost of war, you have to think about obligations to care for vets. And that is another 2 billion of the 8 is like a kind of, we put in a reasonable, and again, this is Dr. Crawford's research, a reasonable estimate of a veteran's lifetime and how much the estimate would be to pay for this. Actually, sorry, that particular calculation is by a scholar at Harvard named Dr. Linda Bilmes. Just she kind of, there's pieces of each of these line items that have kind of been calculated by different people. There's also Homeland Security, which is the U.S. You can almost think of it as if the counterterrorism has been targeted outside U.S. borders, Homeland Security is kind of inside U.S. borders and the kind of prevention of terrorism. Most of which in the United States, by the way, is white. Today is like white extremist kind of, more like right wing type terrorism than far more than any kind of foreign Islamist militant attacks on U.S. soil. Then there's the fact that the U.S. has borrowed a lot of this money to pay for war, a lot of that overseas contingency operations funding. So these are credit card wars. They have the U.S. Federal budget went into the red after 9/11. It was not in the red before 9/11, and it has never gone back. It's just been like an increasing red line down. I mean, but increasing deficit spending as a result of the wars. So there's interest that we have paid and that we will owe trillions more. So we've spent 1 billion so far in interest alone. There's going to be trillions more, even if the funding just completely, the spending completely stopped. And the last line item is increases to the Department of Defense base budget due to war. So these are the things over and above war spending that are like, equipment upgrades and bonuses, like retention bonuses to convince people to go back to the war zones again and again. I mean, the really what we're talking about, you're asking where it goes, like the vast, I mean, over 50% of the money that's in the Pentagon's budget goes to military contractors. So these are the companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman that are
Raytheon. Don't forget Raytheon.
Raytheon, yes. They're building weapons, they are supplying things in the war zones, maintaining bases abroad, those kinds of things.
Hmm. Yeah, it's such an unfathomably like huge figure to
It
try
is.
and get your head around.
I
And
know.
what argument do people use to like? Well, obviously we know what argument people use to justify. So like do we need all of this to be safe? Is there do you do the cost of war conceive of like a military budget that's reasonable? Like, do you have a figure in mind?
There are people who do that. There's a movement even that's kind of gotten some traction even within US Congress to cut the Pentagon budget by 10%. 10%. I'm always disappointed. And I mean, I understand there needs to be kind of reasonable policy goals. And it's great people are advocating for that and working on that. It's really important. But like, it should, in my mind, the Pentagon budget, the US spends more than the next 9 countries combined on quote unquote defense. And so in my mind, what's really needed. And I should say a lot of the 10% cuts, it's actually like would be super easy to do because there's so much waste, fraud, and abuse. So if there's so much kind of fat to skim off the top and get to that very easily. So there are groups who kind of have these very realistic alternatives. There's this Moral Budget for America, this great group called the Poor People's Campaign, has come up with this alternative moral budget for America in which they take a whole bunch of the money that goes to the Pentagon and put it towards like social safety net type programs. So that would be interesting for you to check out. But to get back to this other picture, I mean, so over 1 million Americans have died of COVID. We have so many people, I think, I forget the exact figure, but like tens of thousands of people who die every year because of our car dependent transportation system. We have this climate emergencies more and more, especially the fires out west and the flooding that we've seen with the hurricanes in different parts of the country. And so, really, to answer your question, it's like we need to take a step back and think about what actually is gonna are we talking about when we talk about safety? Like how many people are who's dying of what, and how do we actually protect people? Like 1 million people who died of COVID. Like the US should have far better public health systems in place, and all of that. I mean, if you think about, so every year the federal budget gets negotiated, the discretionary budget gets negotiated in Congress.
Mhm.
And every year, if you think about like a pie chart, a bigger and bigger piece of the pie is going towards security and military and defense. And then a shrinking part of the pie is everything else from, education to housing to healthcare to everything. So every dollar that gets spent on those things like doesn't get spent on these really urgent other priorities like a functioning public health system that would keep people from dying of COVID.
Mm. Yeah, well, tying a lot of things. Going bankrupt as well. I'm working on I've been working on a thing for another project about like the cost of healthcare in America, and it's truly mind blowing how much people fork out or are forced to fork out for like the most basic necessities. And like,
Yeah.
I never get this about your country. Like, isn't a healthy population like a boon economically? Isn't that good for the market? Like, I just don't get it.
Right.
I mean, not that we're doing much. Well, we're slowly attempting to dismantle our wonderful healthcare system. So, yeah. So,
Right.
yeah. Anyway, one of the things that I came across while I was looking at some of your work was this bit of work you'd done on counterterrorism operations under the authorization for use of military force sort of rule, and I was just like blown away at the number of countries. Let me pull this map up for people to see. Actually,
Yeah.
you know it, so I don't need to share my screen. I think, but
Yeah.
for people who are watching, like it's like most of Africa, um, like quite a number of
It
countries
is.
in like Eastern Europe, through Turkey, the Middle East, like the entire Middle East, basically. Then through like Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, all the way down through Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, like then through Southeast Asia. It's just like absolutely mind blowing.
85 countries
Yeah, and
where the US is doing some sort of counterterrorism operation.
yeah, but like the
Yeah.
thing that shocked me is like that this is all being done under the law that was signed in 2001 after 9/11 to like as a counter then as like, oh, you can, like, the president has the authority, I think. Well, actually, would you like to explain it, because you will do a better job
Yes,
than me?
yes, 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 absolutely. Because there is a slight, a slight clarification I have to make. So, 85 countries. This map that you're talking about um, is so I had a team of people and we kind of went in and we basically combed not only US government information and data sources, but also like all the investigative journalism that we could get our hands on to come up with this map of 85 countries in the world. And the last time we did it was between 2018 to 2020, so the last few years of the Trump administration. Although under Biden, it's a very similar picture, despite the US military talking about, the threat from Russia and China being the kind of latest justification for US militarism. These kinds of counterterrorism operations are persisting throughout the world. And they're just kind of changing shape and changing, the ways that they're called, but they're still happening. So, so basically, some of these things are more overt, like airstrikes and combat. There's on the ground kind of exchange of gunfire between U.S. forces in Kenya, for example, and Al-Shabaab militant. Right. So those kinds of things are on the map. The large majority on the map is training and assistance. So this is happening in 79 places that we captured, where the U.S. is going into another country and saying, can we train and assist you in counterterrorism? And as you can imagine, this isn't the sort of thing that the U.S. does in Western Europe.
No, they're
It's the sort
conspicuously
of
absent on that map, actually.
exactly. So the U.S. is doing this in places that are home to Black and Brown people. A lot of people have written about the war on terror as really being, there's just a lot of racism and Islamophobia behind who gets labeled a terrorist and why, and who gets helped in counterterrorism, right? Um, so there's that, and this kind of help is not it's not as innocuous as it sounds. And because of this map, I ended up going to Burkina Faso and doing a deep dive into one of these data points on the map. Like, what does training and U.S. training and assistance in counterterrorism look like in Burkina Faso and West Africa?
Mhm.
And just showed how the government uses this massive amount of funding, which for the US is just like a penny. It's just so the funding for a country like that is really small in the bigger picture of what the US is spending on security, what it calls security cooperation. But it has huge effects on the ground, the way that these governments are using it to crack down a particular ethnic group that has practiced Islam for centuries and is a hurting group at the periphery of the state. And the ways that the government is using this money and the equipment and the training to kind of further this marginalization of this particular ethnic group in the name of counterterrorism. So this is something that's happening not just in Burkina Faso, but in other places as well. To go back to this issue of the authorization for the use of military force, this was a resolution that was passed by Congress just days after the 9/11 attacks in the US. And it basically gives the president of the United States a kind of blanket authorization to carry out counterterrorism, in any part of the world, wherever there are terrorist groups. So the AUMF itself, there's a requirement under something called the War Powers Resolution that that the president reports on places where it's using the AUMF, this authorization, to Congress. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit more of a record of where the AUMF has been used, and it's not a complete record. So my research on that particular thing showed that the AUMF has been referenced by the president to justify counterterrorism in actually 22 countries.
But that's actual, like, on the ground troops, you mean, when you say
that's
that?
actual. Well, in some cases it's airstrikes as well. In some cases it's training. It's kind of like a mishmash, but it's definitely not comprehensive. So even in cases where the president has used this justification, it's not been totally transparent or comprehensive.
The crazy, like, I've talked to quite a lot of people, a lot of whom are very skeptical of the power of the American government. And none of them have ever, and a lot of people who are anti-war and anti-interventionist, and none of them ever mentioned the fact that, like, this authorization is still, like, there from 2001. Like, no one has ever mentioned that. Like, why is this not discussed, like, openly?
Yeah, so there is, there's some really incredible advocates in the, DC peace and anti-militarism space who are really working hard on the repeal of the 2001 AUMF. And there's actually another AUMF, the 2002 AUMF, which was used primarily for Iraq. I'm sorry, I've just learned that I'm mispronouncing it. It's Iraq. And Syria got extended to Syria for the fight against the Islamic State. And then so basically people are trying to repeal the 2002 AUMF because there's so many kind of entrenched status quo kind of effects in trying to keep the 2001 AUMF in place in Congress that people, the thinking is if you can get the 2002 repealed, then you then get to the 2001. But yes, you're right. I mean, it's not talked about enough. It should be talked about way more. And it's when I give talks and things, I tell people, there are amazing groups. Like there's the Quaker group, the Friends Committee for National Legislation, FCNL in the United States, who does a lot of work on this topic. And you can sign up for their email updates in your inbox, and they'll give you like a form, and you can just very easily fill out the form and send a letter to your member of Congress, because they're tracking these particular pieces of legislation and efforts to like repeal the AUMF. It's not something any of us can be expected to keep at top of mind, but when these things come up for debate in Congress, it's so important for people to kind of be writing to their members of Congress in support of the repeal and that kind of thing. So that certainly people need to know a lot more.
Yeah, because like I've been just trying to Google to think of what it is, like to try and think of the name of it, but I cannot right now. But there was a document like circulated like within the US government that then got, I don't know, subsequently leaked or something. But I've heard quite a lot of people talk about it. Like post 9/11, it was like a memo about how they could use this to justify the invasion. I think it was 7 different countries. And that is widely spoken about. This is why I'm like shocked that I haven't heard about this authorization like still being in use, because I feel like it should be mentioned in like the same category, because it seems like
right.
Do you know the thing I'm talking about, or do I need to go away and find this?
I mean, it sounds familiar, but I can't speak to it. But what I can say is that what the U.S. State Department has done is basically add a growing list of militant groups to the U.S. official list of terrorist groups. And so the fact that this justification is for any, they've basically been able to extend it by extending the amount of groups that are labeled as terrorists.
Like, who has the power to put people on that list? Is it like
It's a
just
State
yeah,
Department.
State
It's a State
Department?
Department list. They just thought,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
They, you'd think they'd just never run out of people to put on that list, wouldn't you?
You would think that.
Yeah, it's amazing what people will do once they're given. That's the problem as well. Like that, it's not it's the problem with like reforming anything within like a country that's so huge and has existed for anything beyond like 30-40 years. Is like things get like monstrously entrenched. So like,
Yeah.
and I know you've done like a bit of thinking about it. It's like how would you go about trying to like dismantle this like war based economy? Like where do you begin to like do you have to convince enough politicians that like we shouldn't be spending on that, or like where, how do you think we go about doing this?
Yeah, I mean that is the big question. I think there's people in the US who are really actively talking right now about like how do we begin to dismantle the military industrial complex? And just to give you a sense of the like what we're talking about, I think that's really important. So after the Cold War, the US military budget started contracting, and a big portion of the budget for these military contracting companies started being cut. And so they started kind of with this really proactive agenda, both in terms of convincing the US government that they needed to be kind of more on top of prevention and preventing threats before they arose, and also like jobs. So this is the thing: they military contracting companies have set up, manufacturing in so many states and congressional districts, and so they've basically tied the issue of job creation to the issue of spending on the military. So there's this really widespread commonplace understanding in the United States. It's just kind of people don't question it at all. Like, oh, if you want to have good jobs in this, in this community, then funding the military, having a local, manufacturing company or a base or something like that is a really great way to create jobs. And people don't question that, and everyone cares about jobs. So, we're a research organization. Our piece of the puzzle is not in the advocacy itself, but what we can do is support the groups who are using our research to make change. And so we put out information like, actually per dollar spent, money invested in education or healthcare is going to get you far more jobs than military spending, right? And we've actually lost the opportunity to create something on the order of 2 million jobs in the United States because of this choice for war instead of other things. There is also, we have a new paper coming out soon on what it takes to convert military jobs to, or military manufacturing company to like a green energy type manufacturing. So the case was of these like hybrid buses that were started being manufactured by one of the big military contractors, and what it takes to kind of switch that. So there's those kinds of things that people propose and talk about as well. But then you think about the fact that like over the past 5 years, there were something along the lines of 700 lobbyists for military contracting companies every year annually versus 535 members of the US Congress. So more lobbyists for defense contractors than members of Congress. They have an enormous amount of political influence. And I think they really produce a situation in which the status quo is one of just throwing money at the Pentagon. And it becomes very radical to start to talk about anything. I mean, even a 10% cut, like what I was saying, is like this big deal, and it should be much more than that.
Yeah.
So that's what the military industrial complex, looks like. And I don't have any answers, certainly. But what I do know is that there's just a really vibrant number of groups these days working against different aspects of US militarism. One of them is this Poor People's Campaign that I mentioned that takes its inspiration from Martin Luther King, actually. And his call to work against the three intertwined evils of poverty, racism, and militarism was one of his big things. So they're kind of taking up that call, and they've used a bunch of our research. And you know, to the extent that we can, we're trying to tie our research and our concern with foreign policy to domestic movements that are working on police, the intensification of police militarization, and you know, the kind of erosion of U.S. democracy, and a lot of these things that are really kind of intimately connected to people's everyday lives that most people don't realize is also really connected to, you know, U.S. foreign policy and U.S. racism and inequality and all of these things. They're all interconnected, and they have been for as long as the U.S. has existed as a nation, and even before.
Hmm. Yeah, and probably what also worth noting is that like the people from the lower ends of the income spectrum are often the people who end up fighting in these wars.
Absolutely. And Martin Luther King was pointing that out. You know, he was saying, like, my Black brothers are the ones who are like disproportionately dying in the Vietnam War. You know, he was a big part of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And that's certainly the case today. It's you know, the story of who is in the military is a story of social inequality in the United States. Actually, it's the only jobs creation program the United States has. And if you're looking at people who are kind of trying to have a secure income and, you know, kind of lay out some sort of sense in which they're climbing a sense of job security and a social ladder, then like the military is one of the only ways that's available to a lot of communities.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, it does. I've seen people who for whom it's turned their life around, but it's sad that that's the only option that they have.
Totally,
That they're
exactly. That's exactly
not
what I'm saying.
believed in by anyone else. Um,
Yeah.
so
Or not offer the opportunities to, like, what if there were the same amount of like money for education offered, for example, even just that offered to people as an incentive for growing into, you know, an industry like uh, green manufacturing or education or something like that, you know?
yeah, something useful. Scientists, teachers, nurses, and doctors,
Right.
things we need. Um, it's like so. You talked there about how the Cold War had kind of had at the end of the Cold War there was this like contracting military budget, and I feel like in a sense that we were sort of almost approaching like a period where you would expect the military budget to start contracting. You know, like there was like no new wars started for quite a number of years, and then Joe Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, however disastrously that went. You know, it was still like a positive move in like withdrawing military forces from a
Yeah.
conflict that had been ongoing for over
Yeah.
2 decades, or about 2 decades. Anyway, so like, do cynics would say that the war in Ukraine is being, I wouldn't say deliberately stoked, but has left military contractors not unhappy about the
Mm.
prospect of further war. Like, do you see the possibility that military budgets will just like we're going to see like another surge in like money heading towards this industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think during all the kind of economic ups and downs that the US economy has gone through in the past months and couple years, you know, the military contracting industry is the one industry that hasn't suffered all of those kinds of ups and downs. Like, they've been on a steady course, you know, always increasing profits. And so they certainly, I think there's a lot of money behind why you know, behind the kind of war fever that we see in a lot of the public discourse. I'm all for supporting Ukraine. What Russia is doing in Ukraine is just awful. It's, it's a war of aggression. Many people say it's a genocide. It's horrible. So we absolutely should do something. But I do think that there's a way that the people with a financial interest in the U.S. war economy are seeing this as a nice justification for continued profits.
Mm. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure I saw in the cost of war actually there was a thing about how they were expecting like almost price gouging on military expenditure as inflate with using inflation as an excuse.
Yeah, well, that's another big thing that is being talked about on Capitol Hill right now as a justification for increased military budgets is inflation. So one of our papers by my colleague Heidi Peltier, who's an economist, basically went through all the arguments and showed like actually inflation has pretty much no effect on defense spending for a few different reasons. And here's why you really can't use that as an excuse. But people are trying to kind of, say that that should be why there should be more money for the Pentagon.
Mhm. Well, I hope the same goes when I go looking for a pay rise. Uh, I'll try it.
Yeah,
Inflation.
right.
Uh,
Well, I mean, in your case, it's legit. In
yeah,
the case of the
exactly.
Pentagon, not so much. Yeah.
Mm. Anyway, so like just to sort of like top this off, like we've talked a lot about the reasons that war is costly, damaging to like human lives, to countries, to nations, societies. Like do you think, and like this doesn't have to be the cost of war's opinion, but like do you think there's ever like a justification for going to war? Like, and is there like a good arguments for having like a strong military force?
I think I'm still puzzling through that, to be honest. Like, I haven't quite, I don't know. Because certainly I, like, if you look what happened with, Russia's completely aggressive invasion of Ukraine, you can't possibly tell a Ukrainian like don't fight to defend
Mm.
your country and your lives. So what I will say is that there are so many other ways of like I think in the US there's this tendency to think if we're going to do something, it has to be with military force. Like if we're going to do something abroad to intervene, then that's our option. And I think that there are so many other means at a country's disposal to deal with conflicts and problems, and so much that could be not only talked about but invested in, like just in terms of diplomacy and all kinds of other mechanisms that just don't get enough support and attention because of the really overemphasis on the use of military force.
Mm. What do you think that'd look like? Like sanctions, like stop using their oil, basically, probably. Maybe we should be.
Sanctions are
I Yeah, I don't understand why we haven't got like every factory like available, like pumping out like any like solar panels as fast as possible.
right.
Just like, but like legit, like to obviously like the grid needs a lot of upgrading before it would be able to take like full 100% renewables. But surely we should be pumping out any method of like stacking our energy resources. I don't get it.
It
Like,
it does seem like a no-brainer at this point in world history. You would think that there would be so much more political momentum behind that.
yeah, it's just like energy independence. Be like, great if we did.
Right.
Like, we could just be like, okay, you want to cut the oil off? We are sorted. Like, you know,
Yep.
I don't get it. You know, because like between like some extra renewable capacity and like whatever America has at home or whatever, you know, Britain, we've got plenty of natural gas. It's like if we like just expanded our like capacity a bit, we wouldn't have to rely on all these dictators. It would be brilliant, wouldn't it?
It would be. We wouldn't have to be going to wars to secure access to oil.
Yeah. 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 Be a nice world, wouldn't it? Uh, anyway, Stephanie, I really want to thank you for your time. This has been a pleasure. Really, really interesting
Yeah, you
chat.
too. Thanks so much for having me.
No problem. Is there like any of your work that you want to point people towards before we finish?
We just put out this kind of succinct one pager. So our website is www.costs with an S, costsofwar.org. And we put a one pager together that shows some kind of key statistics of Afghanistan before and after 20 years of US led war. And it's a really revealing glimpse, I think, into what the war really did in Afghanistan.
Oh yeah, I have some stats from that actually that I had pulled up. Um, Before the war, 9% of children under 5 were malnourished. Now it's 50%. Before the war, 62% of people were facing food insecurity. Now it's 92%. And before
Yeah,
the war, 80% of people were living in poverty, and now it's 97%.
that's right. 97% of Afghans living in poverty.
That's what we fought for. That's what people, yeah, I know, fought for. Um,
Yeah,
the world we live in. Anyway,
yeah.
I will put the link for that and some of the other stuff I pulled up and we talked about in the description
Great.
below for people. So yeah,
Great.
thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much for your attention to all this.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment for us in the comments below. Let me know what you thought and if you'd like to see more of this from the show. Thank you, and we'll see you again next time.